Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that gave you enough time to stretch, get coffee, be super awake and ready to talk about inclusive curriculum design. This is another workshop as part of the Excellence in Teaching program. I'm one of the facilitators today. My name is Sarah Mazrui, and I'm an educational developer at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. And today with me, I have Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle Brownstein Horowitz, and I am a curriculum development consultant in the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching.
And Yvonne.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Yvonne Simpson, and ditto Michelle. I'm a curriculum development consultant here at CELT. The land acknowledgement. Toronto sits on the shared traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This is the land of the dish with one spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, one of several treaties which binds us to share the territory and protect the land that is known as Turtle Island. We are also acknowledging subsequent Indigenous nations, Europeans, migrants, and those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly the Black African Canadians brought here as part of the transatlantic slave trade. We respectfully acknowledge the current caretakers and ancestors of these traditional territories today in the maintenance of peace, friendship, and respect. Chimigich. This land acknowledgement, different from those you might have heard before, does have as its base a theme that is central to reconstituting the trilateral relationship between Indigenous peoples, agents of the Canadian state, and Black populations in Canada. I am here today not as a settler, for while Blacks in Canada have been in this country for over 400 years, and we have been beneficiaries of elements of colonization in many ways, we are not its purveyors. We, as African peoples, have not violently dispossessed Indigenous peoples by imposing our legal systems, institutions, and or customs. We, as African peoples, have not forced assimilation on Indigenous peoples into our cultural, religious, or social practices. Given that Canada's colonial conquest of Indigenous peoples and lands was largely funded through the spoils of enslaved African laborers, this reframing of relationships is part and parcel of the projects of reconciliation and reparations. This acknowledgement also reminds us that we each have different relationships in the land that we live on. And depending on our ancestry and where we sit in relation to the struggles for justice occurring on this land, we must acknowledge our place in its protection in a way that is true for each of us. Chimigwich.
Thank you, Yvonne. And I'm going to invite my colleague, Michelle Schwartz, to tell us about the ETP program a little bit.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say welcome, and it's really wonderful to see everyone here. Thank you, Yvonne, for that lovely land acknowledgement. And just I wanted to let people know this is the last workshop in the fall semester for the Excellence in Teaching program. So this is our professional development and teaching program for both faculty and contract lecturers. We'll have a whole new slate of workshops in the winter along with other programming. And if you're interested in participating, in the Excellence in Teaching program, you can certainly register for this year's cohort. There's no time frame to finish. You're not obligated to complete it. It's really just a way to make sure you get all the notifications for things that we're doing over the course of the semester and opportunities that you might like to participate in. So please, sign up if you're interested, and I will turn it back over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Michelle, and my apologies for the technical difficulty going back and forth, but hopefully I've got it figured out now. So next, what we'll be doing is you'll get a chance to give us some information about questions you have about creating an inclusive curriculum. What would you like to know and be able to do by the end of this session? So Sarah is putting in the chat a link to a Jamboard, and we would like to know, what is it that you would like to be able to do? Great. So thank you all so much for contributing. We've got some really great questions here. What is the standard or best practice for inclusivity in the classroom? How can you play a role when you're not at the official table? How can you provide effective content and trigger warnings? What do inclusive classroom look like to students with diverse abilities and needs? Whose needs should be prioritized if necessary? How to approach academic integrity with acknowledgement of different perspectives, privileges, how to design inclusive presentations and workshops for students and staff related to academic integrity, how to support inclusive approaches across multiple courses in a program, how can you ensure the needs of those who aren't voicing their needs are met. So lots of great questions here. I'm not going to be able to read all of them. And then what would you like to be able to know and be able to do by the end of this session? Articulate principles and identify resources to guide inclusivity initiatives within the curriculum. Practical resources that are available for designing an inclusive classroom. So we're definitely going to be talking about many of these today, although we're certainly not going to be able to address all of them. But I think I can comfortably speak for myself and Sarah and Yvonne and say we are more than happy to talk to any of you individually after this workshop and talk to you about how you can do any of these things. But we will definitely be addressing many of these questions. Just want to make sure. Sarah, can you see the presentation again?
Yep, full screen.
Perfect. Okay, so by the end of this session, our hope for you, and these are our learning outcomes for this session, is that you'll be able to really have a good sense of what equity, diversity, and inclusion mean, and that you'll not only be able to understand them, but you'll actually be able to integrate them into your work. Our hope is that you'll be able to have a better understanding of learning outcomes and how you can pair those two things together.
Okay, over to me. Now, I'm sure you're all excited to be here and to engage on this topic of EDI and learning outcomes. And as a starting point, I'm sure many of you or all of you are probably familiar with this graphic image on screen right now, which depicts the overflow and the interlocking dimensions of going from degree level expectations to course outcomes. While I'm sure you're very familiar with this, for purposes of our exercise, let's just think about this for a moment and what these interconnected elements mean in terms of EDI. So I'll just say a few words about each. So when we consider degree level expectations for a moment, we know we're guided by the institutional quality assurance on a framework for what degree level expectations should look like. And this is done in consort with the ministry that provides us with those guidelines. Both these institutional frameworks highlight and emphasize currently the importance and the centrality of EDI in our program level expectations across all institutions, and for our purposes at TMU, across all of our programs. So while you're focused on the course outcomes for your particular interests, we have to also look broadly at the overall dimension of how these interrelate together. When we think about the pan-university outcomes with respect to EDI, we know that our institutional policies, procedures, the culture, and our propositional value framework say to us EDI must be a central focus in all areas of our work culture, in teaching, and in learning as well. So when we think about the university overall and our roles as educators, we have to begin to infuse EDI when we consider learning outcomes as principles across all the university programs. Again, with respect to program objectives, while you may not be looking at learning outcomes in your roles as designing program objectives, they provide a fuel for us in terms of looking at the interface at the student level when it comes to course outcomes. So at the course outcomes level, we're connected to all this, right? We're taking our messages from what does our program say to us about EDI? What does the program outcomes say? What does the degree level outcomes say to us? And finally, as we're writing our course learning outcomes, what are we saying to ourselves when we reflect and engage together to design these learning outcomes? I imagine that you would be thinking about when my student leaves my course, and again, others may think when the student graduates and leaves the program, what might they apply for your purposes at the course level? How will students apply what they've learned with respect to the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion? And that's what our exercises here today will hopefully give us an infusion about how we can do this, engage, and support writing outcomes that foster an application of EDI for our graduates and for your learners in your classrooms.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thanks for that great explanation around those nested learning outcomes. When we were designing this workshop, we sort of took the approach that most folks here would be course instructors and would want to think about their course design and their learning outcomes. So that's the level that we sort of want to focus on today. And just like with any of your other learning outcomes, they sort of get nested into program outcomes, degree outcomes, and so on. You may be having these conversations around equity learning outcomes at a departmental level or a program level, but we sort of all have control over how we're designing our courses. And anytime that we talk about course design, you sort of want to think about it in a triangle form, the course design triangle, where we have outcomes at one corner, and specifically when it comes to equity, when it comes to EDI, what capacities related to EDI do we want our students to have? What outcomes related to EDI do we want to assess in our disciplines? And then from there, we go on to design our assessments. Well, how are we going to assess our students' understanding of the course material? And under that, when we talk about inclusive course design, we can talk about authentic assessments and flexible assessments. And at the other end of the triangle is, okay, well, how are we going to facilitate this learning process? We've set our outcomes, we've set out how we want to assess if our students have achieved those outcomes or not, but how do we facilitate that learning process? And that comes through the learning activities that we carry out throughout the course, so facilitating inclusive classrooms. Now, we could really take any part of this triangle and have a workshop around it, or we could try to sort of cram all of it into one workshop. So we thought for today, we'll just start with learning outcomes. We'll only focus on how to think about and how to write those EDI learning outcomes. We will provide you with some resources for assessments and learning activities, and generally how to create an inclusive course later on in the workshop. But for today's purposes, for the next hour or so, we're just going to focus on learning outcomes. So what are learning outcomes? Why are they not called objectives? What are learning outcomes? Just so that we're all on the same page and sort of referring to it with the same terminology. Learning outcomes usually take a learner-centered approach. And there you can think of them into like three categories. What do you want your students to know by the end of the course? What do you want them to be able to do? And what values do you want them to walk away with? So what do you want them to feel? What do you want them to value? And they sort of focus on competency or change in attitude or enduring behavior by the end of the course, something that happens sort of throughout the entirety of a course, and not just the specific subject matter. So not just, how well do they understand a specific topic, but really their overall achievement, their overall goal for that course. And some characteristics of learning outcomes. For every given course, we could have anywhere between 4 to 10 learning outcomes, but really we want those learning outcomes to be specific, attainable, and measurable. Oftentimes we see learning outcomes that start with, we want our students to be able to understand such and such. And that's great. Really, that is what we want them to do. We want them to understand something. But unless I could, have some magical powers and like read into their brains, there's no way for me to know if they understood something. So how can I get them to, demonstrate that to me? How can I really measure that understanding? So what we suggest is, the way that we sort of write out our learning outcomes would be that, we start with, by the end of this course, students will be able to start with an action word or an action verb, really. And I'll put a link to Bloom's taxonomy, which is one way to get started about thinking about action verbs and where you want your students to sort of reach and the levels of learning. And then continue with a learning statement that describes the competency at the end of that learning, or the why of you want them to be able to do something. So instead of saying, I want my students to understand such and such, you could say, I want my students to describe, or I want my students to research or to demonstrate. So really something that is measurable, actionable, attainable, and specific. And I'll turn it over. I'll turn it over to an introduction for EDI and how we go about thinking about those learning outcomes.
Great. So many of you might be familiar with this term EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion, but you might have also heard different terms such as EDII, EDIA, ECI, or even DEI. And all of them really mean the same thing. And it's this concept that has been around since at least the 1960s, with the idea that education should be equitable for all students. There should be equitable educational opportunities for all students. And while not all students will achieve the same things, they should all be able to achieve at a high level. And it is our job as educators to help get them there. So the concept of EDI is really focused on well-being, the idea of the experiences or biases that you bring into the classroom as an educator, and that your students are going to bring into the classroom. We know that students who come from certain backgrounds, or students who have parents or family members who have had the opportunity of higher education, are more likely to be successful. And that's because they have a lot of privilege and opportunities that other students may not have had. Similarly, there are many other factors that might cause a student to struggle in a classroom, and that can range from anxiety disorders or other issues around disability, to issues around having confronted racism, sexism, homophobia, or a variety of other factors in previous classrooms that they've been in. And it's important to be aware of these things as we're talking about EDI in the classroom, because every student's experience is going to be different, no matter how positive or thoughtful your intentions, because of the experiences they have had coming into this classroom.
Great. Thank you, Michelle, for that explanation. And, based on what Michelle has just said, we already know as members of the TMU community that we're very well positioned in terms of our diversity. Our principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion is already well embedded in our work culture. So many documents have come to us to communicate and convey to us the centrality of EDI in all we do, in our departments, in our faculties, in all of our workspaces. But on top of that, TMU has done an exceptional job in bringing to us some facts, data, quantitative and qualitative information about our EDI, our diversity profile. So what do we know about this profile? What are we informed about as a community in terms of how we're demographically represented and why EDI is even more important when we know about our makeup? We know, for example, that there's quite a diverse student population. 55% of our students identify themselves as women. 48% identify as racialized people. 7% of those identify as being Black, 1% as First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, and 7% identify as persons with disabilities, while 8% identify as 2S LGBTQ. It's important, when I talk about EDI, I think it's important for us to keep in mind that there are people and identities associated with this. EDI is not just a standalone term. We need to think about the identities of our students that come to our classroom. They have identified themselves in these surveys. And TMU is now able to say, this is not what we're saying these students are. This is how they've identified themselves. So it behooves us as educators when we're in the classroom to be cognizant of the various identities of our students and how that might impact in how you shape your learning outcomes, how you interface with students, that you're consciously aware that their presence and their experiences while they engage with you in learning can be meaningful. And there's a relationship that centers on, and Sarah said it at the beginning, the student is at the center of learning. Part of the center of learning is to take into consideration the student's identity. So let's see how we can enrich the student identity in this process. Let's look at our faculties, the richness of our faculties and our departments, what they tell us. We have 7 faculties, 57 undergraduate programs, over 45,000 undergraduate students. This is awesome. And we're a huge, mighty university full of diversity, full of a positivity about engagement. And as educators, the buck kind of stops with us, right, in the classroom, because when we interface with these diverse students, we need to be ready to engage around the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. There are some hidden issues, though, we need to be aware of this. While this looks marvelous, let's think about some of the things that are not so evident. So when we think, for example, of persons with disabilities, the ethnographic information that we receive tell us one thing, who they are, where they are, but they also tell us where they're not represented. And their anecdotal feedback tell us about their experiences. For example, the Greater Toronto has a representation of over 20% of young persons with disabilities, whereas in our faculties and departments, our students' representation, and I was looking further into this, 7%. So there's a lack of equitable representation. Why are students with disabilities not represented at a higher level, to the same level, or closer to the level of 20% that they're represented in the Greater Toronto population? Black students are represented at 7% in our population, and in the Greater Toronto population at 8%. You might say, oh, that's great. If we dig a little deeper, though, and as we look higher in our departments, in the graduate programs, Black students are not equitably represented. So there are different messages, and that tells us how much we need to engage EDI to ensure that there's equity and access to education. We play a role at the course level outcome, but our course levels should tell us our experiences should be more enriching to ensure that students can engage and feel fully included in their learning experiences. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is where we say a picture is worth 1,000 words. You know, when I first looked at this, I said, Sarah, what is this? And then, you know, it dawned on me, this is a very important depiction on this slide to show you the vast expansiveness of how diversity is expressed by our students. So we often think about the equity groups, the equity identified groups, meaning racialized people, persons with disabilities, persons of Indigenous backgrounds, and women. But within this broader scope of diverse identities, there's a multiplicity of identities. In our survey, which was done in the 2018-2019 academic year, 2 pages full of how diversely people identified themselves in terms of sexual orientation, gender identity, nationality, their languages, different forms of disability. So while we look at a top level, the 4 equity identified groups, how people identify themselves, just think about this. Look at the vastness of it. And I invite you, perhaps, if you look at the diversity survey, and I think the link is provided and you'll have a chance to explore this on your own. If you look really closer in, you will find the multiple ways in which people see themselves. And we need to begin to see them in this way as well when we design equity, diversity, and inclusive oriented learning outcomes for students. Let's move on.
Great, thank you so much, Yvonne. So we're going to take about 5 minutes and do a bit of a think share where we're going to be talking about what are sort of the key aspects when we're thinking about EDI-centered learning outcomes. So, and that goes back to the questions that Sarah was talking about earlier when talking about how we shape learning outcomes. So what do you want your students in your class to know about equity? What do you want students in your class to be able to do with the knowledge of equity? And what equity values do you want students in your class to share? So, for example, if you were teaching a class about education, so to students who are interested in K-12 education, what do you want students in your class to know about equity? You might want them to know that students who, as I said earlier, students who come from families with family members who have gone on to higher education and even higher degrees are much more likely to be able to be successful and in completing their degrees, but also in advocating for themselves and being able to do well on tests, all different kinds of things. What do you want students to be able to do with this knowledge of equity? Well, if you were teaching a class to future educators, you would want them to be able to understand that the decisions that they're making in their classroom are going to impact different students differently, and that different students might need different levels of support or different types of assessment or different ways of thinking about how to communicate with them or their family members based on what you know of the individual student and their circumstance. And that the more information that you can have about that student and their circumstance, the more likely you are to help them be successful in the classroom. And then what are the values you would want students in your class to share? Well, ideally, if you're talking to future educators, you would want them to value all students being successful and seeing students as individuals rather than statistics. So that's just one sort of quick example of what you might want to do. So as I said, we're going to take about 5 minutes to think to yourselves, and then we'll just ask for some volunteers. Yes, Jennifer.
Hi. I wrote something out, but then I have which was that I want my students to recognize a variety of inequities, and in particular to be able to pick out some of their own privileges and disadvantages, since they will likely have some of each. but in addition, I teach philosophy, and I am particularly interested, and I think it's particularly important for my students to understand the epistemic implications of inequities, so that privilege correlates with being seen as a knower, being seen as having a voice worth listening to. And so pointing that out, it's important to listen to people who are often not typically seen as knowers, and that the we get a wider, a better picture, a better approximation of the whole picture, or of something like truth. Um, so, if we have the more that we are able to listen to and give platform to voices that are not typically granted that platform.
Absolutely. Thank you. And of course, that's particularly difficult in this day and age when people are often explicitly choosing echo chambers to listen to. It's really important to be able to see the different voices that are out there and to value different types of knowledge. Thank you. Rahel?
Hi, thank you. Thanks for asking this question, because it's something, especially the last question, what equity values do I want my students in class to share, has been a tough one for me, and I've been thinking it through. But so when I think about what I want my students to know about equity, I guess just for some context, the course I'm developing is about policy change and how to make change with policy. And I want them to understand that we need to make sure we have all voices, and to always evaluate which voices are not here and why aren't those voices here. And because we come with our own biases and our own lenses, sometimes what we think is the best solution might not make sense for everybody, right? And who is not included in those solutions that we haven't even thought of or thought about how our policy creation will impact them. I want them to be able to then take information and research and understand that the word peers, because usually when you do research, they research and look at peer contribution and peer research. I find that in North America is really biased to either North American or Eurocentric research. And so we need to consider people in South America, people in Africa, Asia as our peers, and have that lens in our research. And then a new value that I learned from she was a Métis person, was the concept of 7 generations. I'm thinking about how everything that we do, we have to think about what will be the results 7 generations from now. So that's where I am in terms of the values part. I would love to hear what other people have as well, just to see if I can think about it a little bit more broader.
Yes, thank you. That's really beautiful. And I love the way that you described both the 7 generations, which I think is such a critical thing that students, when you're an 18 to 22-year-old, that's not necessarily where your brain is thinking 7 generations in the future. But obviously we see many much older quote unquote leaders in our society also not thinking that way. But also I think this idea of whose voice is not being heard, whose story is not being told, is really critical when we're thinking about EDI, right? Because the way that literature in classrooms is formed is always, who has the most citations previously, and that inherently is going to privilege certain groups of people and make it so that certain voices are silenced. And so the more we can really think critically about whose voices are not being heard in classrooms, the more we can really understand how we are upholding certain values and downplaying others in ways that actually reinforce systemic privilege. Wonderful, thank you. Any other folks want to share? I see in the chat, I would like my early childhood students to be able to advocate for equity-seeking groups. Absolutely. That is so important and true. And I think especially when you're talking about early childhood, when the students are not able to advocate for themselves, it's really critical that these people who are playing such a pivotal role in children's early experiences of the world have a real understanding and a deep appreciation for how different groups of people receive different types of praise or discouragement in ways that reinforce or don't reinforce prejudice. And then we have another comment. I would encourage my students to frame and know that equity is a process of action, of inclusion and open-minded discussion, but not an ideologically fixed notion. They should try their best to understand other standpoints and differences in identities based on a self-critical process of unlearning pre-existing suppositions. And I think that really gets at something that we're talking about, which is this idea that we actually have to really, when we're talking about EDI, particularly when it comes to classrooms and talking about the 18 to 22-year-old sort of typical undergraduate age range, right? We are having to unlearn things that have been taught to us our whole lives, things that we've been able to rely on as truth and may not actually be true for everyone, just because it is true for you as an individual. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for sharing. So some questions to consider as you are thinking about how do you center EDI in learning outcomes. As we talked about, who's in the classroom? Who are you as a teacher and how will you be perceived by your students? And what is the role of EDI in your own research and teaching? How can you make sure that what you think you're teaching is what your students are learning? And then what literature or sources are being held up and what do they reflect? And in particular, as we were just discussing, what stories are not being told currently and how can we ensure that we are giving voice to stories and perspectives that may not typically be uplifted in the literature.
Thank you, Michelle. And I just added in the chat the modified culturally inclusive teaching survey that you could use to sort of think and reflect about your course as a whole as you're thinking about designing your course. And as promised, we just want to quickly bring those learning outcomes to now the whole course design and thinking about other aspects of the course. But this is just a little bit of a flavor, a little bit of things to get you to think about how you can apply that throughout your entire course to create a more inclusive course. In terms of course content, it really comes to deconstructing disciplinary frameworks, especially in certain disciplines that where folks think subjects are very objective and there's not a lot of room for change. Really, it's about deconstructing those frameworks and rebuilding them and incorporating diverse scholarship, as it was already mentioned a lot in the chat and your thoughts as well. So thinking about the diversity of the voices that we represent in our course readings, course material, to sort of display the diversity of expertise that are in our fields. In terms of facilitation and assessment, exercises that center student voices and ongoing reflection exercises. Again, these are things that you have already mentioned in the chat. You want them to think about this as a reflective process, as an ongoing process. So how can you bring your students' voices to the center, have that at the center of your assessments and facilitations, and give them an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to reflect. And just like when we think about our teaching philosophies, I really believe when it comes to EDI in our courses, it's also a reflective and growing process as well. So it's a lot of trial and error and learning, relearning, and modifying things as we go on. And we can also think about community connections and collaborations. Really, we're not experts in every aspect of our course, but really thinking about how can we include underrepresented collaborators in our field? How can we bring in advisors or community organizations into our courses? There have been a few courses that are sort of being designed that I'm aware of that really, make use of community organizations that are really the experts in that field and having them as co-designers of their course, or really thinking about having folks as advisors, guest speakers, guest lecturers, to really bring a variety of those expertise into the course. But I really want to get to the meat of this workshop, so I'll turn it over to Yvonne for that.
Thank you, Sarah. I was so enthralled listening to your expressions of the questions you had and the thought processes behind them. I was so excited to hear your already well-entrenched commitment, and you're envisioning the importance of EDI, how you may engage with this with your students, and thinking about how you teach and what you want students to take away in your teaching pedagogy. I'm just excited to hear that, because in this space, as we come together as learners, we energize each other, right? We motivate and excite each other about our teaching practices. And I hope that we can do more of this in this next exercise to advance of the questions that you thought about in response to Michelle's discussion on the kinds of things you might want to consider in your learning outcomes in advancing that. So let's take this a step further. So I'd like you to engage in this activity, because as you know, practice makes perfect. We all know that as educators, right? So let's take I think we have about 15 or 20 minutes for this exercise. So first of all, let's think about some examples of learning outcomes. And you already stated some fantastic learning outcomes just in how you articulated your thoughts about how to engage EDI. You already have wonderful ideas, and I think we will just advance this a little bit further in this activity by keeping in mind, when we write learning outcomes, they also have to be evaluated, right? There's an assessment component. So it usually starts with that greater idea of, what do I really want to happen in terms of learning outcomes? And then putting that further into the idea of, when I write language, concrete language related to this learning outcome, how will it be assessed? How will I evaluate it? Because then those assessment and evaluation pieces are then created, right? So let's look at some examples and then go towards engaging in the activity. So some examples here that we have on screen, what a student would be able to do, would be able to integrate literature about the portrayal of racialized people in media into relevant theoretical frameworks. Does that sound like a good learning outcome to you? Another example that would concretize this idea of what a student would be able to do would be to describe the ways in which medical research has uplifted Western practices over Indigenous and Eastern knowledge and tradition. And another, reflect critically on personal and professional practice in light of possibilities and constraints created by social construction of knowledge and practice, as well as modern and historic inequity. What we can see in these examples is that thread of equity, diversity, and inclusion spelled throughout. And another thing we can gather from this is that there is not one discipline that is immune from having EDI embedded within. All disciplines can benefit from, and should, as we said at the outset, at the program level, at the course level, and importantly, in the interface level in your interaction with your students. So let's think about an example from science, which is often a tough one. So one of the examples we can think of here would be something along the lines of to utilize maybe cyber science or another type of science practices and systems with integrity, accountability, and responsibility in collaboration with diverse workforce members, multidisciplinary teams, and settings. This learning outcome speaks about how the student would apply this in career and in other settings. And we can see this regardless of whatever discipline that you may be engaged in. What are your thoughts about that? Let's find out when we give you now an opportunity to take some time. Maybe, how are we doing for time, Sarah? How much time can we take for this exercise now?
We could take about 15 minutes or so. I've shared
Okay.
the link to the Padlet in the chat, and it's sort of organized by different faculties. So feel free to add your thoughts to it. We thought this might be a good takeaway resource for everyone as well. And I'm also going to open up some breakout rooms. You don't have to go into them, but we thought if you wanted to get together with colleagues from your faculty and sort of co-create those learning outcomes, that could be an opportunity. And I know some folks have to drop off early. I'm also going to share the link to our feedback survey in the chat. We would really appreciate it if you can also fill that out. So maybe we can take about 10 to 15 minutes to work on learning outcomes. Maybe until 12:15 actually, and then come back together to take them up.
Okay, great. So you have the option of, going into a room. This is the fun part of learning outcomes, right? To do it collaboratively. So if you were typically doing your learning outcomes in your program, or maybe there's a course that's taught in sections, sometimes colleagues can come together and do those learning outcomes jointly. So envision yourself perhaps in that framework, in that exercise, although you may not be with all your colleagues here today. Maybe take the attitude of, we have a course section, we have to write learning outcomes for a particular course or a discipline. And we can go to the breakout rooms and do that together as an exercise, as Sarah suggested, or we can remain here in one group. But please use the Padlet so we can have a chance to review those in 15 minutes time.
And as you're working through writing these learning outcomes, this is not a silent activity, so feel free to ask any questions you have, or if you're like stuck somewhere or not clear, or if you want to just talk it out, that's fine too. We're happy to do that as well.
Hi, Sarah. Sure, I'd like to talk it out because I don't have anybody from my team here. So I can share the one that I put in the Padlet. I'll put it in the chat. So I put two. The first one was explain the meaning of public policy and how the policy cycle works. And the second one was produce SMART goals they will use to take action. So it's kind of short.
That's great. No, I love it. I think it's specific, like we said, and it's actionable and attainable. Maybe for the second one, produce SMART goals that they will use to take action. Is it sort of related to the first one, to public policies and public cycle works?
So the idea is that we will train them to understand public policy and the policy cycle, so that at the end of each course and after, well, I should say at the end of each class and after the 8 classes, they can go and action everything that they've done. So them creating a SMART goal in the first class would be for them to start thinking about what issues they want to work on in public policy and what steps they can start putting together. So it'll just be a start of it. They'll continue and kind of it'll evolve as they learn more in all the other sessions. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think it's really great. So I feel like it's also like a reflective process. So they would probably start by having these SMART goals, but then it's something that they work on throughout the whole course. So it might be interesting to sort of bring in that end piece as well. So this is where you start, and this is how you're adding or reflecting throughout the course on it.
Okay, so saying something like produce SMART goals to produce SMART goals, they will use to take action. Maybe I feel like I have to take that part out for now. So produce reflective SMART goals. I don't know.
Well,
Okay.
Rahel, I'm just wondering, as we talked a little bit about sort of how you can use how you want students to consider voices that aren't often considered,
Yes.
or stories that aren't being told. And I'm wondering if there's a way you could incorporate that concept into either of these.
Yeah, especially with equity seeking groups. So, especially with respect to policy, because this is an opportunity for students to reflect on equity seeking groups and apply this in their future careers, right, as future policymakers. So, maybe some language around equity seeking, equity deserving, or equity identified groups, SMART goals that may have an impact for equity groups.
Okay, hold on. I'm trying to capture all the feedback. 1 second. So this is what I got. So how can I add like the value of other voices? Right. I'm just summarizing the first point. And then the other one is using language around equity seeking. What were all the other ones you listed?
Equity deserving
Okay.
groups.
Okay, so actually using that language in the objectives itself. Okay, that's very
That's right.
helpful.
That's
That's
right.
very helpful.
Yeah. And then, because as you think of that, right, we speak about ensuring that you can then develop an assessment piece or an evaluation piece to see if the student is gaining competency in that particular outcome.
Okay.
Can you envision how you might assess that? Because that's kind of the internal test, right? Because you write the learning outcome, then you think, oh, how would I test for that? How would I evaluate, or how would I assess if the student is gaining competences? Given that learning is sort of a scaffolding purpose, you might have your design in such a way that it will start at a minimal level and the student is gaining competencies in this area. So you're developing your evaluation skills, your evaluation tools to ensure that the outcomes that you're wanting to see exhibited in the student is able to be assessed. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense. My brain is just glitching because I'm like, yeah, how will I do that? So I'm thinking, just plainly, if they're creating their SMART goals, then they will incorporate how or where they're getting their research from, or which voices that they're including in the goals that they're creating. I think that would be the most obvious. Am I on the right page? Like, am I picking up what
Yes.
you're putting down? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly say something to the effect of produce SMART goals that consider the needs of equity-seeking groups, or that center the need equity-seeking groups.
That's right.
So you can be direct in what you're trying to achieve as long as you are being specific and actionable and measurable.
Yeah.
Okay, that's so helpful.
Mhm.
Okay, awesome. So I'm gonna look at the other ones that I have and do a little tweaking.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's great.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Rahel. And I see there are a few more examples on the Padlet. Feel free to keep adding to it as you think about your course. We're hoping that we could have a good representation of different faculties and disciplines so that you can look back and get some inspiration. But we'll leave the Padlet with you. And just wanted to share a few other resources that you might want to consider when thinking about your course design and EDI around it. The first one is the Culturally Inclusive Survey that I already shared in the chat. And there are a series of short videos that we created for QP contract lecturers, but I think they apply to everyone really. just some reflective questions and some tips around thinking about representing diverse perspectives in course content, strategies to engage all students, creating a positive classroom environment, equity and inclusion in assessments. So once you're done that, that learning outcomes part of your course, feel free to have a look at these other resources for some inspiration around other parts of your course design. And we'll leave the last slide up for you to sort of have the link and the QR code to our feedback survey. We would really appreciate it if you take a minute to fill that out for us. And while we leave that slide up, we'll also just stay behind for folks. If you have any questions, we're happy to answer them. But as Michelle pointed out earlier as well, feel free to reach out to any of us as you're thinking through your learning outcomes, and we'd be happy to sit down and go through them with you or your course design in general.